Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Apex Magazine live stream for our third edition of Snap Judgement. This is a stream where some of our editors and a very special guest will be offering some brief critiques on submissions sent in by some of our subscribers and patrons from the first pages of their genre short stories or novels up to about 250 words. I will be reading the submissions out loud, and if at any point our editors feel that they would stop reading and reject the piece from the submission queue, they were going to raise their hands. If all three hands get raised, I'll stop reading, and then we can talk about that feedback that they have. The judges' critiques are meant to help you hone your craft and answer the age-old question of what are the magazine editors really looking for? We receive a lot more stories than we can cover in the 90 minutes that this stream will contain, so your entries have been randomized, and we will go in the order that fate has set for us. So we apologize in advance if we don't get to your work, but thank you for your patience. My name is Arley Grauer. I am the Apex Magazine podcast producer, the audio editor and producer. I'm very happy to be hosting today's Snap Judgement. I'm very excited to see what fate has in store from these submissions, but I would love to have you help me welcome our editing judges. First, we have Lesley Conner, Apex Magazine's managing editor and author of the historical dark fantasy novel, The Weight of Chains. Hi, Lesley.
Hi.
Welcome, and thank you for being here. We also have the man with the titanium jaw, the editor-in-chief of Apex Magazine and owner of Apex Publications, Jason Sizemore. Hi, Jason.
Hello.
Thank you for having us do another Snap Judgement. I'm very excited.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure.
And last but certainly not least, we have our very special guest judge for this round of Snap Judgement, Arley Sorg, a 2021 World Fantasy Award finalist, co-editor-in-chief of Fantasy Magazine with Christy Yant, and senior editor at Locus Magazine. Welcome, Arley.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're so happy you could make it, and thank you for offering your wisdom and your insight into the submissions today. We're excited. All right, my friends, judges, are you ready?
Yeah.
Bring it. Oh,
Very
did you mention that these entries are completely anonymous as well?
Oh, that is a good point, Jason. Yes. The entries have been stripped of their titles and authorship for the time being. So our editors have not seen these before. Our judges have not looked at these before. And they will be offering that critique purely based on the words on the page. So that's very exciting. It's a good opportunity for all of us to sort of get some insight into what that's like. The other thing I did want to mention is that due to some technical what's-its, we may or may not kind of blip out briefly at the 60-minute mark. We're hoping that won't be the case, but if it is, just stay tuned. We'll be back right away as soon as possible. We're going to try to get through as many of these as possible in the 90 minutes allotted. So let's begin. Do you want me to read the titles or no?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
The titles,
Yeah.
Are the titles important? The titles
Yeah,
important?
titles are part of the story. They're super important. So.
Okay, great. I will include the titles then. This is From the Depths. I'm closer to the prime spot than I've ever been. 2 long strides and a few people shoved aside, and I'd be standing on the golden circle, arms spread wide, face turned upward to receive the sun. Kaya always liked to make fun of how many lottery winners struck that pose. Acting like the fucking rapture, she'd snorted, when everyone should know by now that he's abandoned us. But I saw the day her number came up. The slight lift of her chin, and the way her arms twitched as the holes in the cave covering Wolf Eel Station lined up just right, the way it did once a day this time of year. When the beam of light lit up her face, I swear she was dying to open her arms and soak it up. She's been gone 7 years, and still the memories haunt me. My gaze drifts upward through the clear dome overhead, thick plexilite curved to keep the immense water pressure at bay. Most of Wolf Eel Station resides in the mesopelagic zone, over 200 meters below the ocean surface. But the sun globe, a bubble sticking out from the top of the station like a crow's nest, is technically in the epipelagic, where the real sunlight still shines through. I check the timer on the wall. 1 minute remains. Silently, I mouth the countdown. 59, 58, 57. Jenny Huang! Someone shouts from the edge of the room as they start pushing their way towards me.
They made
no
it.
hands. Yeah.
They made it. Yes.
Strong
No hands
start.
raised.
Exciting.
Yeah. Okay, so I did feel like this was a pretty strong opening. Lots of imagery that really caught my attention. The lights coming in through the solar bubble. And also, you raised some questions early on, like, what was it, an unknown death 7 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Or I was not a fan of the transition from the introduction to the, I guess, the first act, into the first act, because it just felt tonally different. Maybe ease us a little better into that part of the story. Although granted, we didn't get very far in, and possibly my opinion would change on that if I were to read the next sentence or two. But yeah, this would I would keep reading. Well done. What?
I agree. I would keep reading because I'm kind of, I want to know why. Like, why are they in this situation where they only get the sunlight like once every year? But I would suggest that the author maybe go through and read the piece out loud to themselves, because there were a few points where I was just like, there isn't anything wrong with the word choice per se, but there were few points where there were a few words where I was like, I wonder why that's the word they chose, rather than something different. And it's like I said, there's nothing wrong with the word choice. There's nothing that I can point to and be like, no, that's definitely the incorrect word. But it just felt like there were points where maybe as Allie was reading it, that it felt a little off, like it could be a little bit smoother. So that would be my one big suggestion, would be to read this piece out loud to yourself, and where do you maybe feel like, oh, well, that doesn't feel quite right. Let me reword it slightly just to make it feel smoother. So that's my only big suggestion that I would have.
For me, I would have kept reading, but I'm right on the edge of putting it down. The thing that's happening for me is that the story is raising maybe too many questions and not giving me enough story to actually chew on. There's so many possibilities going on, so many hints without giving me enough details that I actually care about. And the details that are given are world building details instead of character or story details, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But me personally, I would have liked a little bit more character and or story detail to chew on to really get a hold of the sense of the story itself, rather than a lot of questions being raised. So for me, what happens after this line, after that last line you read, what happens next is super critical, because I'm right on the verge of putting the story down, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Awesome. I think that's all a really solid amount of feedback to start us off today. I think that's really great. I like what you said, Lesley, too, about reading things out loud. As somebody who does acting and podcasting and audiobook stuff, it's so vital to the experience of the reader. Even when you're reading it to yourself inside your own head, it feels different. That's a good point.
I'm going to jump on a little bit of what Arley said. It's been my experience that when you create an opening using a setting and world building in your first 200 words, that transition is critical because the editor, in this case Arley, is like, okay, this is nice, this is cool. I want to see the character and what the conflict is going to be. So, you know, a pretty opening like that sometimes can be better served after you introduce the character.
Yeah, that's a great point too. All right. Anything else, or should we move on to the next one?
Next.
Ready to roll? Okay.
I want to support what you said about out loud, reading out loud, and what Lesley said, because podcasts are such a huge market and they're such a huge way to reach audience, you know, so like knowing what the story sounds like these days more than ever is super helpful in terms of just how your story performs in the market. So yeah, super great points.
Great observation.
Absolutely. Okay. The ladder. Sarah opened her eyes in response to the sudden flashing alarm behind her eyelids. Not that she'd been sleeping. Sleep wasn't a thing she caught and held onto anymore. More a slippery eel, it teased her with fatigue before cranking her thoughts into self-destructive overdrive in the dark. She sat up, shifting her thin nightgown over her thighs. The stark walls of her apartment came into focus through the haze of another night with too little sleep. It wasn't a big place, maybe 25 meters square, all sharp edges and smooth gray surfaces. A sphere of sunlight shot through the porthole next to her bed, lending a cheery cast to the otherwise stoic space. Across the room, the small processor dinged. For a moment, she stared at its tiny clear window with a deep sense of dread. Half the stuff that came out of that thing tasted less like food and more like licking a sidewalk. Today, however, the light inside bathed what appeared to be a croissant in an attractive amber light. Her stomach growled. Screw it. With a sigh, she got to her feet, and a cup slid into a narrow indentation in the wall. It was promptly filled. Okay, that's all three hands up.
All three.
Yeah.
So the reason I decided, I was like, okay, I can ride this out. We're almost to the last 250 words here. Then it occurred to me, all right, nothing has happened. She has woken up, and she's going through her morning ablutions, you know, that kind of stuff. I know this author is trying to use it to world build and maybe build a little character. It's just not very interesting.
Yeah, my biggest feeling was I've read all of this before, and not just once or twice, like a lot. And I really felt like that opening, I almost wanted to immediately raise my hand right at the not that she'd been sleeping at the end of that first line, because I kind of was like, I mean, how many times do editors say, you know, don't start a story with your character waking up? And I kind of felt like, obviously, that's where the story is starting, but they're tacking that on to kind of like cheat that. Like, they really wanted to start with them waking up, but she's not waking up. And so I immediately was just like, ugh, like if she's waking up, like if that's what you're starting with, like you're starting with her waking for some reason, then you got to make it different and make it exciting. Not just do the same thing, but tell us she wasn't really sleeping, because that's just kind of working around what editors see so often. And it's like, yeah, well, you didn't make me believe it.
Yeah, I mean, hardcore agree with both Jason and Lesley. Basically, if you're looking at getting through 1,000 stories, you know, in a slush pile, probably 800 of them are going to be decent. And this is decent. This is fine. It's okay. There's nothing, quote, wrong with it, but there's also nothing interesting about it. And what it's doing is something that we just see people do a lot. So not only is there nothing really that interesting about it, it's something that is overdone. I thought for a moment in that opening, when the author said sleep wasn't a thing she caught and held on to anymore, I thought this was going to be about insomnia or some weird sleep thing. So I had a moment of interest, but then the next paragraph doesn't give me what I thought was the potential of that opening, where it's like, oh, this isn't really a waking up opening. This is something completely weird and different. And it ends up not being weird and different. It ends up being very, customary. It ends up being very what we see a lot of. So, I mean, I feel like this is very, not to upset anyone, but it's very ordinary. And your story can't be ordinary. It has to be intriguing in some way in order for us to keep reading. I also have to say, for me, this is really fascinating. I'm like, part of me, I'm looking out the corner of my eye to see where everybody raises their hands and to hear what they have to say. So it's really cool. Yeah.
Something else that struck me as something we see time and time again, specifically in sci-fi stories and sci-fi novels, is these food processors where they get the food and it's completely bland. And people in general are just such foodies. Like, so many people, like, they live to eat. Like, people like food. And I'm kind of like, where is the sci-fi where they're like, they have created the machine that will make them amazing food rather than just gray mush,
Yeah. There's this line here before we stopped, which is, with a sigh, she got to her feet. And something I tell authors sometimes is, if your character is sighing and bored and nothing is happening, then your reader is sighing and bored and nothing is happening. And the other thing is, that I think about this story is, there might be a really cool idea 3 pages in or 9 pages in, but sometimes you can't wait 3 or 9 pages in to have your cool idea, because we're never going to get there.
Right. There's been many times when I've been reading submissions where if I get to page 3 or 4 and I'm like, nothing's happening, at that point, I'm like, I can't keep going. Like, there's 20 pages, but like Arley said, I may have 100 more stories in my queue that I need to get through. I can't wait till page 10 for the story to really pick up.
Yeah. And that's why this is such a great exercise, because I think, the writing itself is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And maybe, a crit group might read the whole story because they're going to read the whole story. But editors and slush readers are not going to read the whole story. So, when you're sending your stories out, that's something you really have to think about, is who's reading it and why. Unless you have, a string of awards and a career, and it hits, we read anonymous, but it hits Jason's desk, and maybe Jason will be like, oh, Sam Miller, well, this is probably going to go somewhere. But, a lot of writers don't have that. So you've got to really do something at the beginning.
That's a good point. Yeah. I think that's really good to remember too, that like 250 words is our set limit for this particular exercise, and that feels like not very much at all as a writer. That feels like not enough at all, but we have to remember that from your perspective, you're trying to get through all of these stories in the pile, and you need to know right away, right? Like, what is different, what's unique, what's exciting.
I would venture to say 75% of the time, after the first 100 words, you'll know whether this is a rejection or has any chance.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a powerful reminder, actually. All right. Yeah. Shall we move on to our third?
Yes.
Excellent. Apple of Discourse. In the time of Prometheus, all was dust. Prometheus existed only to die over and over, of course, so that we may benefit from his repeated demise. His livers were carried by the eagles to our orchard and dropped on our cursed soils to feed them. Livers are full of bile and vitriol, and this is what we needed to seed our fruits. For discord is not sown from harmony. No, it is sown from hate, from pain, suffering, and the liver of one who thought himself above gods, above man, above all. We sirens are below all, which is why we must tend the orchard of discord. And I am lowest of all, as it is I who sift through the blood and detritus to find the fallen apples, take their least desirable seeds, and toss them out over the cliffs of Olympus, throw them into the gales of woe to carry them away. As nothing survives here but the worst, which is why we are here. Our apples appear as beauty and luster, each one of them more golden and shining than the last, more imperfect and ruinous.
Okay. Well, for me, the story just was not going anywhere. It had a fairly strong, interesting. All right, I'll back that up a little bit.
Yeah.
I have seen that opening a few times before, even with Prometheus, and used as a metaphor for what's going to happen in the story. So you have that, but I was like, okay, I'll let that slide. Just see what goes on here. And after the Prometheus and the liver stuff, I was like, okay, let's have some hints at what the conflict will be. Maybe let's meet a character. None of that happened, and it just felt like we were just going to continue into world building and more descriptions of magical stuff.
I really enjoyed that first line. That first line, I was like, "Ooh, maybe we're gonna get something really, really interesting." I am a fan of retelling of stories, so that was good for me. I stumbled on the line where his livers were carried to the eagles to our orchard and dropped on our cursed soils to feed them, because it confused me initially, because I was like, to feed the eagles, and then it hit me once it kept going. I was like, oh no, okay, it's feeding the orchard. Mm-hmm. But I did stumble there, and I felt like I then had to catch up with you because you were reading it, because I was in my mind mentally trying to figure out who that them was. But then I agree with Jason. It just felt like it wasn't, like, I started so excited and was really ready to get into this retelling or twist it and make it super interesting. And it just felt like it was just spinning its wheels and not going where it needed to go.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I felt like the story was leaning mainly on philosophy and language, and neither of them were doing anything that was super interesting. So for it to be leaning on those things weren't strong enough elements for me. I do like that opening line as well, but it's almost like, give me some story to chew on after that. There just needs to be more here in this opening, especially because, like, I think Lesley said, or maybe both Jason and Lesley said, I mean, anybody who publishes fantasy gets tons of Greek myth retellings. And as soon as I see the word sirens, I get tons of sirens stories. And so, there are just certain things that, I'm going to get in a month, 100 mermaid stories. I'm going to get 30 Selkie stories. And so your story, it doesn't mean you can't write about these things, but it does mean you have to ask yourself, what stands out about your story besides it being a siren or a Selkie, especially in the opening? Because I'm going to get 30 siren stories at least a month. So, the fact that it's mostly leaning on language and philosophy, and neither of those are that interesting, and the fact that we hit this element that I see a lot of, and honestly, for me, it's just a hard pass.
When did you raise your hand, Arley? I couldn't quite see.
I raised my hand right before you got to the word sirens, but my eyes hit the word sirens right before you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard for me to read at the speed that you
Yeah.
that you're reading aloud. So
That's okay.
I got to the word sirens. As soon as I hit the phrase, we sirens are below all, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like if that had
Exactly,
been
yeah.
personalized, or if it had given, if that had, because I did get there, if that line had given me at least a semblance of, you know, personal investment rather than generalization, or some sort of sense of story, or some sort of sense of, you know, really beautiful language, or something just interesting, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't even wait till then, because for me, a lot of the elements are stacked against you from the beginning, you know. Unlike Jason, I don't see Prometheus used a lot, but, you know, it's still Greek myth, and I see Greek myth tons.
For sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
It's used a whole lot in mainstream media.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are certain myths like Prometheus, right? And, you know, Icarus is another one I can think of that I feel like people reference a lot, right? There are certain ones that just, they're so attractive to us because it's very relatable, accessible. I don't know. It's a big enough metaphor that we all can like get our hands into it and try to use it for something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, we've published a couple witch stories. We've published a couple mermaid stories. We've published siren stories. So it's not like you can't sell those stories, but it does mean you have to really ask yourself, what are you doing differently? Like, what is interesting about the story besides the idea of it, besides it just being a witch or a siren or Prometheus?
Right. Exactly. I mean, and there's nothing that says, I mean, there's something really good about going to those mythologies, because you are kind of like, okay, my readership has this like common knowledge, which is good. That's a good idea. Like making sure your readership has this common knowledge that you can then build something really interesting and different off of. But that's the hard part. Like you need to make sure that you're not just going back to the same mythology and rehashing what 20 authors ahead of you have rehashed, because then you're just struggling uphill, because it's like every story that we read that feels the exact same, we're like, we've seen this, we've done this, we need to move on. We want something new and fresh. So it's great to have that common knowledge from your readership for them to an understanding, but you've got to make sure that you're twisting it in a way that is still going to surprise your readers. Because if it just feels the same all the way through, well, we've probably already published that, or we've definitely read it.
Yeah, I would say, if I'm being more useful to this particular author, there's this line here about the livers being dropped on the cursed soil, you know, and it's like, if this is more than just a philosophical line, you know, you could get into your story right after that line and show us how this is important to the character, for example, what the character has to do with any of this, rather than getting into all this generalization, or, you know, like bring the story up to that moment and get into what you're really talking about with this piece, rather than what a lot of us in the industry call throat clearing, which is like, well, I'm working my way up to what the actual story is. I'll get there, but we're not going to get there with you. So just bring the story up.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was going to mention that reading it out loud made me want to read it like a grand sort of prologue to something. The way the language fits together feels very much like that. And I have had many conversations with writers and authors and screenwriters too about how prologues are used so often in movies now. Like a lot of Disney movies use prologues. And when that sort of is a common theme structurally, we want to do that because that makes sense. If I do this prologue, I then set up the fact that the story is going to be about this and it's going to feel like this. It's like it's like we're pulling the dust cover off of something, right?
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. From a reader standpoint, it's not necessary all the time. And certainly from an editorial standpoint, you're like, okay, it's a prologue. Here's the rest, right?
Yeah, it's again, and it's such a different way that we're engaging with the story. Like if we're sitting down to watch a show,
Mm-hmm.
you know, our expectations and what we're willing to deal with, what will engage us are totally different than if we're reading a piece of fiction, you know. And I think a lot of times writers will write something because they're visualizing it in their head the way that they would see it cinematically, and that doesn't always translate well, because on the page sometimes it's just not interesting enough, but visually it can be interesting enough.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that.
I think that's called overwriting sometimes.
Say
overwriting? What? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Overwriting, yeah. All right, should we move on to the next?
Yes.
Gone to the roaches. The gashes in my left palm overflow with blood. Rivers of rain and blood roll down my fingers to splatter the slick sidewalk. My blood disappears into roadside puddles. 5 years ago, I would have stood back to avoid the car's splashings. But the insects swarming over New York City never allow their spindle legs to touch any roadside hazard. I don't have to worry about an accident killing me before my ride delivers me to the hospital. The street in front of Monbon's corporate campus overflows with their latest bioengineered marvel. Giant cockroaches scuttle over the concrete to ferry passengers sitting inside their carapaces. They climb over each other and their slower millipede cousins, the green public transportation dreamed up by Monbon's Go Green bioengineering director, my tech lead's tech lead. I could call a roach coach. But I can't move my fingers. If I wait... Okay, that's all three. Jason?
Okay.
Or do we want to switch and start with Lesley this time?
Is this the fourth one?
I think so.
Yeah, let's start with Lesley then.
Lesley?
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to point out is that blood is mentioned 3 times in the first 3 sentences.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't, like, okay, we get it. You have like a gash on your palm, you're going to the hospital, but I was just like, wow, like we're just gonna keep going back to that. And then after that, I totally was just overwhelmed by all of the stuff they're trying to shove into that very first paragraph. Like, I know a lot of times we're like, you need to get to the story. Mm-hmm. You do need to get to the story, but there is just an awful lot going on in that first paragraph. Like, we're talking about these insects swarming, and like, you know, 5 years ago they would have been trying to avoid cars, but there is no more cars, and it's just a lot that I was just like, ooh, I need you to slow down just a bit, because there's just so much crammed right there. And it was like, I felt like at that point, as a reader, I would have been like, all right, I need to pause and try to digest all this information. But then it didn't let up. There was no pause to allow us to kind of digest what's going on. They just kept throwing more at us. And so this is a time when I'm saying there's just too much crammed. And it isn't anything about the character. Mm-hmm. It's all about this world. Sometimes you need to kind of like give us some character and slowly show us this world. But we got an awful lot real quick.
Mm-hmm. Arley?
Yeah, similar, I think overlapping with what Lesley said. Using the word blood 3 times feels like somebody trying too hard to shock me, and I don't shock that easy, and I don't care. But more importantly than that, for me, this is a narrative disconnect. If you open with gashes and all this blood gushing out, the next part for me is just, this isn't what the character would be thinking about. This isn't what the story would be, you know, and especially not in this tone. For me, it's so obviously like, you know, as we say in the industry, my world, let me show you it. You open with a problem, and then let me talk about, you know, you're using the problem as a thin excuse to do a lot of world building, info dumping, and it's a narrative disconnect because I just don't feel like this is how this scene would play out in reality. So it's just too much. Early on, I'm like, no, this isn't working for me. I can't vibe with it. I can't get into it. It's not. Yeah.
Jason?
All right, so I get to be the first mean one of the evening. I just thought the first paragraph was poorly written, just to be honest. But you know, looking at the rest of the excerpt, I felt that you know, there is some good writing there, and I think the writer here should excise that first paragraph and start and make his or her second paragraph the opening paragraph, because it has, you know, has your setting, and it also raises a question, you know, bioengineered giant cockroaches. That is going to hook readers into reading way more than saying blood, 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 blood.
That's true. I totally agree with that. Like, I would have probably been way more interested with that second paragraph opening. But if I'm just slushing, you know, I'm already done with it because I had such a big narrative disconnect. But I think Jason's got a great point.
Yeah, like I just went back and reread it, and I was like, yeah, you totally could just cut that first paragraph off. You don't need it at all.
Yeah, it definitely begs the question, why is this person bleeding this badly, and waiting and thinking about whether to call an ambulance or a roach coach. But if you start with that, the street in front of Monbon's corporate campus, and then it goes to the next paragraph, which is, but I can't move my fingers. If I wait, will my hand ever recover? That says something about that character being like, should I call an ambulance? Or that's, I don't know, I think that's kind of interesting.
It raises the stake of the story right off.
Well, and it gives us a little insight into how that character thinks, because if you go farther, they're talking about, like, there's the aerial, the flying prototype, but it won't cost anything. So obviously cost is something that they're having to weigh their health care versus the cost of getting to the hospital. Well, that's interesting. Like, that's something that's relatable. Yeah. Rather than being like, my hand's bleeding everywhere, let me give you a whole bunch. So yeah, I think cutting that first paragraph off greatly improves the story.
Definitely. Shall we see the next?
Yes.
Full service stop. The cracked asphalt under Kate's back is warm from the previous day. July nights never feel cool enough in this part of the Ozarks, and the hot road soaks in her sweat. She hears tentative footsteps and turns her head away. She doesn't want to see Anthony's boots. For one, they're not his boots. They're stolen, though it's not like you can buy boots now. Kate, Anthony says, his tone light, but underneath is the annoyance and exacerbation of waking up another morning to find her gone. Jesus, in the middle of the road? What? You think a car is going to run over me while I'm sleeping? Anthony doesn't respond. Of course a car wouldn't run her over. Cars no longer work. Instead, he stands there, and when Kate makes no move to peel herself off the deserted country highway, he says, "We need to go. It's at least mid-morning." How can you tell? Her voice is hoarse, but her tone is venom. She did not speak to her husband like this before the world fell apart, but now she feels justified. It doesn't make it any easier. He's better off without her. That's why she disappears. She doesn't go far, not yet at least. She just can't fall asleep near him. Anthony doesn't respond to her question or tone. He looks to the sky reflexively, but it tells him nothing. It's the same dark green-gray it's been for 118 days.
They made it!
Yay!
Yay!
I like this one. I feel like the author is, like, we know that this is some sort of disaster. Like the cars are no longer working. The sky is, a green-gray color. We're getting a lot of character development between the way this husband and wife are interacting. We know that obviously whatever is going on that's caused the world to fall apart is definitely putting a strain. Like, is Kate gonna leave? Is she gonna just go off and sleep far away? So I think that's really good. That's really strong. The only thing that I would say to kind of give the author maybe a little bit of help is look at that first sentence again. There's nothing wrong with it. It's okay. It just didn't grab me. Like, it didn't wow me. And I'm just wondering if there's a way to rewrite it where you could make it just a little bit more interesting to where that first sentence gives you even a bigger leg up. But overall, I want to know what's going to happen to their marriage. Like, I'm invested at this point.
Yeah. Arley?
Yeah, again, for me, this story made it, but I'm a little bit on the fence. I'm not quite as on the fence as I was with the earlier one, but I'm ready to push the button. I really like the opening. I like the scene. I like the visual element. I like the idea of somebody laying out in the middle of the road. I think all of that is really cool. I also like the way that the tension is built paragraph by paragraph so that each, as you're reading, you get a little bit more of things are kind of bad, as well as things might get worse in particular specific ways that are important to the characters. What didn't work for me is that some of the world building throwaway lines felt a little bit shoehorned, almost like they're there because the author wants to give you information more than necessarily that this is what the character is really thinking in this moment. Like the line about, it's not like you can buy boots now. For me, it didn't feel genuine to the moment. And the other line, what was the other line? Of course, a car wouldn't run her over. Cars no longer work. It didn't feel genuine to the moment. It felt more like the author's trying to let me know about the world. And there's enough stuff here, the way that it builds, that I'm getting stuff about the world anyways. So they don't necessarily feel needed, at least not in these moments. I'm more drawn in by the tension between the characters and the interesting elements of the characters. The last line, he looks to the sky reflexively, but it tells him nothing. Yeah, I don't know yet, but it seemed like the story opened in Kate's POV, and then this to me is a POV violation potentially. So I'm waiting to see if this is, going to continue. Is this meant to be a floating POV or what, or is this an error? And something like that wouldn't keep me from reading, or it wouldn't make me stop necessarily, but it also distracts me. So if it does turn out to be an error, it depends on how strong it's kind of like the story has to be stronger to keep me engaged. I wouldn't reject a story because of a slip up or an error or a typo or anything like that. But they do build up and they do distract me from reading. So it depends on what happens next.
That's a great point. Jason?
So I'm going to suggest that the writer cut these last two paragraphs. I think your opening ends with he's better off without her. That's why she disappears. Everything after that is just chaff. You can just get rid of it. I would remove the internal observation that cars no longer work. Give that as a reveal at the end of the introduction. so that the reader knows, okay, this world, something's going on, instead of telling us with, internal monologue. It's been 118 days. The writing, I think maybe because I feel like it's a little bit bloated with a lot of extra exposition, really. I know you hear the phrase, you need to tighten this up some. And a lot of times when I hear it, I roll my eyes because it's simply, an overused maxim. But in this case, I really think going through and doing some self-edits, you can turn this, what is already a pretty good opening, into something that will have Lesley and Arley and I just like, oh, I can't wait to get to the next page, So you're almost there.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that none of us raised our hands speaks to that, right? So
mm-hmm. I was going to say, to call back to what we were talking about before with as writers feeling the urge to write cinematically, to write how we see it unfolding for a reader or an audience, that this, to me, in reading it, felt very cinematic in an effective way. That, like, I can see Kate, I can see the asphalt, I can feel the warmth, I can see the kind of the camera tight on her and then turning away as the boots step into the shot. Like, that feels very purposeful. But I would be interested to see what else happens in this story because that intro is so strong.
Yeah, I loved that line. Those two lines. He's better off without her. That's why she disappears. So powerful. Great ending point to Jay. I totally agree with Jason. You have your break there or whatever. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Huzzah. Shall we move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, hungry. I'm Vlad. 'Twas a night drenched in dreams as the moon gently swings wide upon an invisible hinge. A dark figure is jettisoned out of the celestial doorway. He almost does a somersault as he doubled back to gently close the moon door with an echoing sigh. It wouldn't do to let anything weird wander out from the in-between again. The figure then continued to dash downward. Vlad was running late, and he hated to disappoint his children. They were beautiful twins, his Luca and Luna, his moon gifts. He skipped and stumbled down the sky, sometimes swinging from star to star until he finally landed on firm earth. He shivered as he looked about the sleepy neighborhood. It's colder than Cthulhu's limp tentacles tonight, grumbled the vampire. Smoothing his pencil-thin mustache, he twirled his hands with a flourish before digging into the inner folds of his midnight cloak. He produced a long pink scarf, which he proceeded to wrap around his ashen face. It was a gift from his little girl. The children. Right. Still running late. It would be their birthday at the stroke of midnight, the one night he never forgets to be with them. His little babies were finally turning a century old. His little babies were dying. He walked up to a large building with the sign, Shade Tree Retirement Homes and Hospice Care, hanging above the red double doors. He knocked thrice. May I come in? He purred. The doors opened wide.
Okay, I'm gonna open with, if I was reading this in the Apex Slush, I would pass on it. Because it definitely doesn't have the feel of an Apex story. But from a reader's perspective, I'm intrigued. Because, I mean, the Dracula and Blood is very, something that we're all very familiar with. And this gives me something different. The only thing that I kept wanting this to be funnier than it was, if that makes sense. Like, it reads to me like it should be something that's not like, ah ha ha ha, like a knee slapper, but just you're like, clever. And I just felt like it was on the brink of being super clever and super funny. but it wasn't quite there. And as a reader, that's what I wanted it to be, because you've got Vlad going and, you know, he's putting on a pink scarf. Like, it feels like it has those elements. Like, that's what the author was trying to do. And it's not quite there for me. And that's what I kept waiting for. I kept waiting for it to be like this very clever, very funny piece about Vlad and his twins. But then we get to the point where he's going to the retirement home and you're like, oh, wait, like maybe there's more here than what it's kind of was set up at the beginning, if that makes sense. Because it's like, you know, his twins, it seems like, may not be vampire twins. Like, they may be living because they're on the verge of their 100th birthday and they're going to die soon. So it's like I'm feeling very conflicted as a reader, because I was wanting it to be one thing and it has elements of that humor, but then at the same time it's taking it in a much more serious direction with, you know, Dracula Vlad having these human twins who are about to die. So I feel very conflicted. Like, I don't know how to feel about this piece, because I'm like, I'm intrigued, but I don't know if my expectations as a reader are gonna, you know, I'm not sure what they're supposed to be. I guess that's the best way to put it. Like, I'm not sure what it's supposed to be, because it felt very much like it was supposed to be humorous, but then at the same time, it didn't feel like it delivered that. And then you get to that retirement home part and you're like, oh, well, maybe it's not supposed to be humorous. And if it's not, then my expectations as a reader, I'm going to feel very let down. Like, I'm going to feel like I was led to believe it was one thing and not. And we can't tell in this 250 words which way it's going to go. So I'm just conflicted.
Well, with a title like that, I agree that those expectations are inherently there, for sure. Arley?
Yeah, for me, I get so many stories that are basically a writer trying to be clever, and I don't feel like they're all that clever. Or a writer trying to be funny, and I feel like they aren't really that funny. So I think that, first of all, that is, you know, something I see probably a lot more than people realize. Second of all, I think that, so for me, I probably would have put this down right after that last line. I would be done reading it. There's something kind of somewhat interesting going on here, but it doesn't interest me enough to keep going. For my thing is, if you're writing humor or cleverness, I feel like the smartest people who write those kinds of stories, they're doing multiple things right from the bat. Below the humor and cleverness, there is still a strong narrative going on. And the reason that that's important is because humor and cleverness is so subjective. One person who thinks something is funny will be totally different from another person. Or, you know, one person can think something is funny and another person will think it's not funny. So if you have a strong narrative as well, it's not only relying on the humor and the cleverness. This opening paragraph is so much about the humor and cleverness and not enough about the story. I feel like a lot of these lines are just getting in the way. They're not really creating enough that is going to grab a lot of readers. And so I feel like with some editing, you know, some really thoughtful editing, this could potentially do something, because there is the heart of a story. I mean, we know that the kids are going to die, but what we don't actually know is what the character is going to do about it. Like, what does that matter? How is that important? We're told a couple times that the character is worried about being late. So maybe, but then that's resolved by the end of the page. So that's not a real narrative problem. It's not a real story problem. The real story problem is the kids dying, but we don't know anything about what the character plans to do or why that is difficult. So I feel like a little bit more story paring down some of the trying to be clever and or sharpening it so that, to Lesley's point, you know, maybe it's hard for me to say because, you know, I hesitate to say what is funny or clever, what isn't, but I know for me, the cleverness and the funniness isn't quite working here. So maybe sharpening those, paring down that first paragraph to what is really hitting and developing the story a little bit more on that first page so that the reader, you know, if the humor is working, then the reader will keep going for the humor. And if the humor isn't working, the reader will still keep going for the story.
Absolutely. Jason?
I really don't have a whole lot to add to Lesley and Arley's excellent analysis. I will comment on, I think the writer has created an interesting character and introduces them in an interesting way. It can be a lot stronger, especially with Arley's recommendations. I wasn't put off by the slight use of humor. I thought it was low-key and whimsical, and maybe the rest of the story is violent and gory. I don't know. You can never tell with vampires, you know?
You can never tell.
And I didn't raise my hand. I was like, okay, and it's got a little bit of momentum. It has a nice pat, cutoff point. I would probably read another page or two with the hope that, the story progresses better. So, a little work. Could have a winner here.
Awesome.
Winner, vampire dinner.
Vampire dinner, yeah. Yeah, definitely some very clearly intriguing visuals in this character's introduction. Very fun to read out loud for sure. But yeah, definitely would be interested to see where that goes. Shall we see the next one?
Give me a quick moment.
Of course.
Sorry.
If we were going to get cut off, it would be now or soon-ish. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Was that 3, or are we gonna?
Yeah, we're on the 7th one. So the next one we'll start with Arley. Okay,
great. What a fun surprise for him. So I know Arley said previously that a typo or a small structural error like that wouldn't stop him from reading on if he was genuinely curious to see where it was going. For both of you, same question. I did notice in that last one that there were some shifting tenses, which stick out to me when I read things out loud, of course, because you can hear it more clearly and you go, okay, wait, are we present tense? Are we past tense? Where are we? Does something like that make you want to, forgive and move on, or do you tend to want to stop at that point because it signals something to you?
A few typos does not make me put a story down. Now, if it's like a few on every page and it's becoming one of those things that it's like they get in the way of the story because that editor part of my brain is kicking into overdrive, that can really distract from a story because when I'm reading a story, you want me to be all in reading that story, not trying to fix it. Because if I'm trying to fix it, then I'm not actually absorbing your story. Like I'm working at that point rather than judging the story on the merit of, is this something that I'm reading and I'm enjoying and I think that our readers will enjoy? Because I don't want our readers to be reading the story and trying to fix it. So if I'm trying to fix it when I'm reading it in the slush, then I'm like, that may be an issue.
So there's two levels of problems with the manuscript, and one is technical, which is what you're kind of speaking about, and second is plot, developmental. And if a piece has some poor technical aspects that I think a good copy edit will take care of, I can usually overlook it. It isn't often that I will take a piece that I think has a intriguing core but needs some work around it, because it just takes a lot of time. And and we're getting multiple hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of submissions each month. Honestly, we'll probably find a story just as good that won't require me to spend 2-3 hours on it. So clean manuscripts are nice, as Lesley said. You have errors, and you're giving the reader not opportunity to bounce out the story because of a technical error, but I wouldn't generally sweat it.
Awesome. That's good to hear, because I know for a fact that I myself and many others have hit submit on Moksha only to realize that there was a big typo on the first page, or something silly like that, and then we spend the rest of the month just like slowly dissolving sanity wise because we're sure that that's the reason why it's going to be rejected. But
it almost never is the reason.
Yeah. For me, if I'm really into your story, when I'm reading in Slush, I'm not even going to see that. Like, I won't, I'm reading, I'm not editing, like, if that makes sense. So I just don't even see it unless the story has not grabbed me. And then all of a sudden it's like, my brain's like, I need to look for something to keep me, So yeah, if it's a really great, solid story, I'll read right over your typos.
Awesome. But obviously, clean manuscripts are preferable.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's easier. Yeah. Awesome.
And it's different if it feels like the person isn't even trying.
Oh.
Right. And you can definitely tell.
Yeah.
I imagine so. All right. Are we ready for the next round?
Yeah.
The Crimson Trap. The cool glow of the midday sun did little to pull the stinging cold from Annika's fingers and toes as she crunched through the refrozen snow. Soot lay atop the pockmarked surface, swirls and gradients of the stuff defining the windswept landscape. There was an ominous beauty about the place, the way the light and the smoke painted the barren vista, but all of that was lost to her. She had one last trap to check. One last vial to fill, and then she'd finally have the funds to escape from this horrible planet. It was slow going. Her dog, Meanie, hopped from one of her footsteps to the next. His legs bore smears of blood where the edges of the frozen surface had cut through his thick, black and tan fur. Her heart ached at the sight of his wounds, but his tail was curled high, and his eyes shone bright. He was working and happy in his way. He could smell their prey, even through the filter that perched on the mask covering his muzzle. Annika stopped to catch her breath, heart roaring in her ears. The goggles above her own mask fogged from the effort. A few strands of her graying black hair had escaped the hood of her parka and danced in the crazed wind. She swung her arms about her, clapping thick, shapeless mittens against her back. The soot that had settled on her shoulders lifted again in a great cloud. Okay, so we had Lesley raise a hand, but Arley and Jason did not. Let's discuss. Arley, we're going to start with you this time.
Okay, so I didn't raise my hand, but I am very close to putting it down. There's some cool stuff in here, some cool basic ideas. I like the visual elements of it, I guess, but I just need more story. It's a lot of thinking and describing and not a lot of what is actually important, what's happening, what is the character trying to do. We get a general goal which is nice. But I feel like it's kind of throat clearing. So I would just, at least for me, this opening could be thinned out, trimmed down a little bit, and a little bit more meat to the story put in to really make this work. What happens on the next page, I could put it down on the first line depending on where it goes. If it's more description, more introspection, more thinking and looking at stuff, I would probably put it down. But, I want to see Annika do something or something, and if a little bit more happens earlier on, it probably wouldn't hurt, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I want to know what's in the trap, like already. I don't know what we're doing, but I want to know what's in that trap. Lesley, or do we want to do Jason and then Lesley?
Yeah, Lesley.
Jason.
Lesley goes last.
Lesley, you go last. Jason.
Wow. Arley, you hit that one out of the park. I was going to say very next line would probably dictate whether my hand would go up or not. Although reading back over it, I kind of think I should have raised my hand. I think if I was in like editor mode and trying to burn through submissions, I would have gotten to the third paragraph and be like, has anything happened in the story yet? No, nothing has happened. Which, it's nice that there's a cute dog. That's a bonus. But the fact that nothing has happened is killing this opening. And it's a frozen scene. There's not a whole lot to describe. We know it's cold. There's going to be snow. So just get to it, Lesley.
Yeah, like Jason said, we have found out nothing. The only line in this that I was like, ooh, was that line about she had one last chap to check, one last vial to fill, and then she'd finally have the funds to escape from this horrible planet. That's what I want to know about.
Yes.
The rest of this could all be boiled down to she has a dog and it's cold. Like, that's what the rest of this is basically saying. Because she's describing how cold it is, and obviously she's outside and there's not a whole lot around. Is that the only reason this is a horrible planet? Like, it is that what's so horrible about it is that she's basically alone in this barren landscape where it's very, very cold? Or is there something more interesting about this planet that makes it horrible that we're not seeing? Like, she gives you a tiny taste. But again, what is she trapping? What is in these vials? Like, are they vials of blood? Is it some sort of serum? Is it like, pollen? Like, what are we putting in these vials? And that's the interesting part. And we're not getting any of that in this opening. All we're getting is that it's cold. And it's just, I grew very bored very quickly because I was like, yes, I know, it's cold. Please take me back to that interesting line. Because I have a feeling buried under all of this cold and snow, there is something very interesting going on. Like, she definitely has a purpose for this story. She's trying to get off this planet. And I'm assuming the rest of this story is going to be her trying to get that one last vial so she can get out of there. But you got to tell me, like, that's what we need to know, not that it's cold. Like, that's all I felt the rest of it was telling us is it's cold. Even her describing the dog was telling us that it's cold because of the way that she's saying, like, his feet are bleeding and it's because of the snow and ice. So basically you're just doubling down on this point. And I thought that first line already doubled down on that. So, okay, we get that. Give us something else. Because if that's if that is what's making this planet horrible, then you need to tell us that she hates the cold, and that's why she hates this planet. If it's something else that's making this planet horrible, then tell us what that is, or, you know, what's in these vials. Like, you know, how long has she been doing this? How long has she been trying to fill these vials? Like, there's so much there that you could be giving us, and I just felt that it was rechurning the same point, and I feel like the author needs to go to the beach somewhere where it's warm. Like, you're so cold.
So one way to rewrite this opening and to express that it's damn cold is, and I'm going to suggest this because I think this might be a person versus the environment kind of story. Open with a scene where maybe she's fallen into a crevice and she's climbing out, or, you know, in media res, or whatever you call it. And that way, you know, you're able to show us the dangers, show us the setting, and you notice I'm saying show us instead of telling us, and you'll likely have more interested editors then. We like stories that move. Not that we don't always, won't always throw out more thoughtful, slower pieces. But a story like this just feels like, to me, it should be moving.
I was going to say, I'm sorry, Arley, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I feel the instinct to be like, I mean, because the author says it was slow going. So I feel the instinct to bring to the reader, to the audience, how slow it is, how difficult it is, how cold it is. I feel that instinct. I get it. I get that instinct a lot. I do it myself. So I can see where that's coming from. But it's really fascinating because this is a very clear setting for all of us, I think, in hearing it and reading it. It's a very clear setting, and we're getting a tiny little bit about the character, but I think we all want more of that. Because the setting will be there throughout. We need to jump ship to the character, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that the purpose of the story, like filling this vial, like that is the meat of this story, and it's not the setting. And once, like, if we had gotten to that vial and then it had gone on to tell us what she's trying to collect, you know, and how long has she been trying to collect it? Like, I feel like maybe I would have stuck with it, but instead we just went on, like, back into the setting. And I feel like there's something there that's very interesting, but we just aren't getting it. And we're not, and I don't know how far, like, am I going to be reading 4 pages of snow? Or is it going to start picking up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The thing is, like Jason said, is that sometimes stories can be slower stories, quieter stories can be great, but it doesn't feel like this is working in that way. So it feels like this story needs something more in order to work. The cold is being belabored, but it doesn't feel important. So why are we talking about it so much if it doesn't feel important? She's just walking through it. I'm kind of like, why aren't we starting with her being at the last trap? Why are we talking about her getting to the last trap? Why not start at the last trap? Why not start with something happening? The hyper focus on the dog, like, give me more focus on her. Like, we don't know anything about her by the end of this opening, except for that one line. So, yeah, I mean, the things that we learn about her are kind of trivial. Like, she has graying black hair. Cool. So do I. Like, so what? You know, like, there's not enough stuff in this opening that is important.
That's a good point. I was going to say too that I think some of the feedback we've all been experiencing throughout this episode of Snap Judgment is that a lot of these stories show the impetus to reveal, the impetus to describe and like set the scene, and then insert the audience into the character's shoes after that. When what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that from an editorial standpoint, from a Slush standpoint, it's so much more productive to give us a hit of the setting and drop us into the character right away. What is going on? What do they want? What do they need? What can't they have? That moves it forward faster.
Unless the setting is super interesting. You know, you can open a story which is focused on the setting, but then that setting has to really work in some way. It's got to be super interesting, or it has to be important. It has to feel important. You know, this just feels like we're talking about the cold and the snow. It doesn't feel interesting or important enough to warrant being the focus of an entire page, you know. It feels like, give us a couple lines and we get it, and then move on to something else. But there are definitely stories where the author really draws you in with the setting description. But, you know, it's kind of like anytime you lay down a rule, there's always going to be one or two people who can blow that rule apart. And the question is, are you really that person who can blow that rule apart? Are you the person who can give us a page of setting and make it really interesting and draw us in? And in this case, it's not working, but there definitely are authors who can do that. I don't think this is one of those stories, though.
No.
It's the same with exposition. If you told Kim Stanley Robinson, don't write exposition, he would have no career, you know. But not everyone is Kim Stanley Robinson. Most people, you know, overburden the exposition. Most people cannot do it in the way that Kim Stanley Robinson or a number of authors do it. It doesn't mean that nobody can do it. It just means, like, realistically, are you the one who is doing this in an intriguing way, or are you somebody who, you know, needs to break down your exposition a bit and figure out what you need, what you don't need, spread it throughout the story, and et cetera, et cetera. So beware of rules, but there are also things that work for a lot of people. So maybe they apply to you, maybe they don't. But you have to honestly assess who you are, how you want to write, what you're doing, and if it works.
Definitely. Shall we look at the next one?
Yeah.
Bone Diamond. Before the sunset, my grandmother and I watched Copper, the king's aunt, exit the castle on foot. It was a strange sight, since most of the castle inhabitants moved on travelers. As the gates of Bone Castle opened in the distance, its metallics creaking could be heard even through the distance between the castle and the willows. Copper stepped out with a guard escorting her on a traveler. The machine's silver legs resembled the claws of birds, but propelled itself forward in a steady, unnatural rhythm. The guard stopped at the edge of the path that abruptly stopped somewhere halfway to the willows. Copper continued forth without a pause. This was the first time marriage negotiations took place in the willows. All the other times, my sister's grandmother and I bid our aunt farewell behind the weeping willows as she trudged toward Bone Castle, guided by the wind. Perhaps this meant we were making progress to some degree. Perhaps the king was only toying with us. I crouched on the other side of the opening of my aunt's home. Its exterior made it almost impossible to see inside. Almost. The branches intertwined, shooting upwards. An empty trunk was what it resembled. Okay, that's all three. Arley, you are going first, but you also raised your hand first.
Sweet.
So let's hear about that.
Okay, so for me, just this first paragraph was giving me a lot of stuff. Like, it's just giving me a lot of words. It's a lot to figure out in a paragraph, basically, without any story to grab onto. It's too much for me personally. I feel like the second paragraph, this was the first time marriage negotiations took place in the Willows. That is the first really interesting line. You know, I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. But by then I had raised my hand because that first paragraph, like, I'm trying to figure out what is Copper, you know, who is the king's aunt, what is Bone Castle, what are the Willows, what is the Traveler, why is it escorting her on a Traveler? There are just so many elements here that I have to figure out on the fly. And if I'm reading through 500 stories, you know, it's too much without a sense of compelling story behind these elements. So that's why I stopped.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Oh, sorry.
Jason?
Go ahead. Oh, did I interrupt you?
No, it's your turn.
Okay. This has some word diarrhea.
I haven't
Especially the first paragraph. It is just, there's just too much going on. Maybe it would work better if you had a different cadence to the opening. Maybe had some dialogue, or opened with that this was the first time marriage negotiations took place in the Willows, and then kind of had the setting and characterizations waterfall from there. It's really hard to make a judgment on the potentiality of this story because there's nothing. It's just the mass of words. There's nothing here outside of maybe some of the sci-fi aspects with the machines. There's not a lot here to interest me, and I finally had enough when we get to the aunt's home, and then we get some unnecessary descriptors there. I was like, oh, okay. Writing's fine. Just jazz it up a little bit and think about story's rhythm and how it plays out in the reader's head.
That's a good point. How it plays out in the reader's head. So it sounds like we're also looking with this piece in particular at in what order do we reveal information to the audience? Like, when do we need to have those descriptors of what the home looks like and the castle and the Willows, and when do we need the action first and then kind of slide those descriptions in on the fly? Lesley?
I feel like, based on these 250 words, that maybe we're getting the story from the wrong character. Because nothing is happening to our narrator at all. Like, nothing's happening to the narrator. But the king's aunt is leaving the castle on foot and is being, escorted by a guard that's on the Traveler. So that's where I kind of want to find, that's what interests me, is who is she? Why, if obviously it's rare for people to be leaving the castle on foot. So did she choose to go on foot, or was she forced to go on foot? Like, I almost wonder if they completely deconstructed this story and rewrote it from a different character's point of view. Like, is the narrator really the central person in this story? And based on what we have, it feels like that answer's no. If the answer is yes, then why is the story starting out the way that it is?
That's a really good point.
Because I just, right off the bat, I feel like we're watching the story happen to somebody else rather than being in the story. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually, because we've talked a couple times so far about, knowing when the story starts. When does it really start? And when should it start from an audience perspective? So do you think that that's a good way to sort of assess whether you've hit it right on as a writer, that like if you're starting in the right spot with the right character, it fits. But if you're starting with a different character that's not your POV character or your main character, then maybe consider why you want to start there.
I just feel like from where this story is starting, that the interesting character may be the king's aunt. Like, that might be the story that is really compelling. Like, what is her relationship to the king? Do they have a good relationship? Is it a bad relationship? But without knowing what goes on beyond this, maybe it shifts. And our narrator is the main character. But if she's the main character, why are you starting it the way that you are? Like, that's something that I would really say, sit back and look at it and go, oh, well, okay, if the editors are looking at it and they're focusing on the king's aunt, and I directly pointed them there, but I was wanting to bring them back. Like, you've got to give me, because our narrator does nothing in this 250 words. It's not their story at this point. They're observing a story. So if that continues, then you've got the wrong character.
Makes sense.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that are potentially interesting kind of buried in here. And I feel like the focus is on the setting rather than on the story. And if the focus shifted a bit, to be on the story and then to just fill in the setting very deliberately, piece by piece, the story would probably work better, because you have the thing about the marriage negotiations. You have this line about perhaps the king was only toying with us. Both of these elements are potentially strong story elements, but because the opening is focused on world building, they become throwaway lines. But if you shift the focus to be on the story, then you develop a little bit more why these are important to the character and to the people. And that will make it, I think, a more compelling, interesting story. And there are probably some interesting world building elements here, but in this opening, they're actually getting in the way of the story rather than supporting the story. There's some family stuff in here. And I have, a gut sense of there being some intriguing story elements, but they're just, the focus is off for me in this opening.
The focus, I think, is a good way to sort of describe that.
Yeah, and to Lesley's point, changing the POV could shift that focus in the way that makes it work. But I think for me, the thing that is not working is just what the story is. The story is talking about the wrong part of the story, essentially. It's talking about the world instead of the people. Like, why are these things important to the people?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think we are almost at the end of our time for this stream of Snap Judgment, but I've been given the go-ahead that we can do one more if everybody's game.
Yeah, I'm down.
Yeah.
Awesome. The Secret Magic of Flowers. Winter desperately needed to make a friend, so she snuck into the garden shed at midnight, heart thundering in her chest. She'd have to work fast. Just 5 hours ago, Papa had asked if she knew where to find the shed's key. Lying burned Winter's throat like fire, but that shame hurt less than losing the last bits of Mama wood. Papa had already purged Mama's influence from the greenhouse, the kitchen, and the library, hiding his bolt cutters bought Winter tonight, but Papa never left a job unfinished. First stop he'd make tomorrow was the hardware store. Winter drew the blackout curtains. If Papa caught her, she'd get more than an earful, and stretched on tiptoes to pull the light switch chain. A naked bulb's warm yellow glow illuminated cluttered shelves packed with hand-labeled jars of dried herbs and flowers. Bundles of lavender, chamomile, and rhododendron hung from the rafters, filling the room with a heady potpourri. Winter laid tools and ingredients on the workbench table nestled against the back wall, choking back the lump in her throat as she followed Mama's recipe. Cut a 12-inch doll from a swatch of canvas. Stuff it with yarrow for everlasting love, rosemary for remembrance, angelica for inspiration, thyme for courage and strength, and sage for wisdom and immortality. Squeeze 3 drops of blood where the heart should be, then stitch everything together with thread woven from the hair of someone loved and lost, using the same needle that pricked her finger.
Hey, another one made it.
Huzzah!
Yay! Another
Good
one
job.
made it.
I feel like I should have an air horn for that. Let's get one of those for next time, please. Thank you. Should we take Arley, Jason, and Lesley in that order?
Yeah.
Awesome. Arley.
Okay, so for me, again, it made it, but I'm right on the verge of hitting the reject button. So as is, it really depends on what happens next, because it is kind of like the opening kind of focuses on the same thing. It's an extended focus of the same idea. And so I need the story to do something to progress, basically, and I need it to happen now. I really loved this idea that Winter desperately needed to make a friend. Like, I love that opening line. That really works for me. But then we haven't learned that much new stuff from there by the end of the opening. I am mixed on that last paragraph where it details the spell and the process, because it kind of doesn't matter. Like, this could be any list of ingredients, and it doesn't change anything, you know? Like, it's cool and all, but it's not like super interesting. It doesn't get me to stop reading. It just doesn't do that much for me. And I've seen it in a lot of stories where they'll like list the spell ingredients, but some stories will have really interesting spell ingredients, you know, and this here is like, it's fairly standard stuff. So it's not terrible, but it's not doing that much work in terms of what the story does. Like, if Papa caught her, you know, that is her desperation and being worried about Papa are the two main driving points of the story. So that's kind of a problem because, I mean, by the time you get to the end of the page, I mean, she's done the spell. So in a way, you kind of feel like those problems are resolved, maybe. So what happens on the next page is really important. I mean, and there are a couple questions that are raised, and I felt a little bit confused by the opening as well. I feel like it could just be edited, and it's almost like the story is done. So what is the story about? Is the story going to be about hiding the friend from Papa? Is it going to be about the friend is dangerous? Or is it going to be about multiple attempts to create a friend? And it's like, at the end of this page, you don't really know what the story is about. And I think for me, the opening could be developed in a way that you get a better sense of where the story's going and of what the stakes are. And it might feel stronger for me then. I mean, I would go to the next page, but if the next page is just continuing to talk about the same stuff, if the story doesn't, you know, start to go somewhere or give me a little bit more to chew on, I would probably reject it. It's not bad. It's just like, it needs to do a little bit more to really stand out. And, you know, it brings to mind like some stuff by Shauna McGuire. It brings to mind this story by Lesley Arima, where the mom creates a doll, you know, as a surrogate for a child, and then all these people are giving her grief. So, this story could also go to places that are kind of overdone and trite, or it could go somewhere really interesting. And so that's also really key. And, you could telegraph that on the first page a little bit better. Mm-hmm. Like, this is why this story is interesting. And if you don't, then this next page really needs to show me why this story is interesting. Like, the concept in and of itself of making a friend is not new. The concept of doing spells to have friends is not new. So I really need to, see what happens next. But bringing, developing it a little bit earlier wouldn't hurt as well.
Mm-hmm. Jason?
Okay, so I'm going to approach this, I guess, from a different perspective in that I really like the opening. I think the first sentence, a little unwieldy, but it also does a good job raising, questions like, what the heck's going on? There's a garden shed. Why does she need a friend? And then we immediately find out there's some tension. Maybe she would get in trouble. Papa called her, and her mama is in bits for some reason. So what the writer has done is created this expectations for the reader that is simply not addressed enough. And I think that's, for me, that's kind of what I'm struggling with. Some of the details in the next two paragraphs are interesting, but as a whole, they're kind of bloated and can be cut down to one or two sentences. I thought the first paragraph could use a rewrite. The first line was fairly strong. And I was like, okay, I'm going to listen on. I want to hear what will happen if Papa catches her, or maybe there's going to be she sees Papa in the distance and has to go scuttle and hide. I wanted some tension. That opening promises me some tension, and it's just not there at all. Intention in an introduction is fantastic, and that will get you passed through the slush quickly. I think I'll just leave it at that last good point there.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you.
Lesley?
Thank you. Good night.
Lesley. Oh, I think you're muted, Lesley. Yep. Still muted, I think.
Sorry, I muted myself because my family is moving around the house and I'm trying to not have you hear their footsteps. It wasn't until we actually got to that last paragraph while she's talking about getting the ingredients together that I was like, she literally needs to make a friend. Like she's making a friend, not like making a friend.
Yeah.
So for me, I was like, okay, because I'll be honest, I very nearly in that middle paragraph put my hand up because I was just like, I felt like the first sentence she's saying she needs to make a friend, then we're getting this long drawn out description of her family. And I kind of was like, okay, you're not telling me why your family is going to be in the way of making a friend. You know what I'm saying? And so I was almost like, all right, you opened with something and then you just push that aside and are telling me the family dynamic. And obviously it's almost setting up to have this like kind of gothic feel, like you've got a missing mother figure and the father seems to be very overbearing, which is good. I like that. But I felt like you dropped that first part and then all of a sudden you pick it back up with the ingredients. So I kind of feel like these details, because I feel like they're important. Both the family dynamic and the literal making of the friend is important because it's, you know, setting up the story. But I feel like it could be revealed in a different way. Like, don't just list the ingredients of the spell of how you're making the friend, but find a way to kind of intersperse it among the way that you're describing this family dynamic, where you have, you know, the absent mother figure and the father's, you know, getting rid of anything in the house that will remind the daughter of the mother. You need to find a way to kind of mesh that together so it doesn't feel so disjointed. Like, because I was like, oh, we need to make a friend. Now we're just going to not talk about the friend. We're going to discuss the family dynamic. And I was so close in that middle paragraph to just be like, all right, I'm done, because I feel like you're talking about something and now you've gone completely away from that to describe the family. So you need to kind of find a way to like mesh the two so that we're not just getting information dumps, a laundry list of the ingredients of the spell, or like tick boxes of like, these are all the ways that my father is horrible. Find a way to work them in together that makes both of them more interesting, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was going to say, too, that in reading it, I started to think, and then was pretty sure by the end of the excerpt, that the friend that she's making isn't a friend as like a separate individual, but more like a way for her to keep Mama alive in some way, which that's very interesting to me personally. But I was curious whether that was intentionally obscured, or do you know what I mean? Like whether it was intentionally uncertain what kind of friend Winter was going to make. But it seems like Winter knows the recipe. It seems like she knows what she knows what she needs to do the thing that she wants, but we don't know what that is.
Yeah.
And I think that if we got a little bit more, because I get the feeling like there's that hint that Mama is the one, obviously, who's given her this knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So how? Like, did they hide it from Papa, or does Papa know? Like,
right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, there's so many things here that are potentially very, very interesting. And I just feel like in these 3 paragraphs, that's almost like I need to describe how many ways Papa is bad. And I need to give you a list of this recipe. And it's just kind of like edging around all the interesting bits.
Yeah. First of all, I need to keep Mama alive, so I'm making this doll would be a cool story. So.
Yeah, that's why I was like, oh.
Yeah, somebody write that. Yeah. And second of all, it's like, oh yeah, Papa wouldn't want me in the shed, but I'm already in here, so that's that. What is Papa gonna be giving you grief about next? That's what we need to know.
Right.
Not what he would have given you grief about, but is too late to do now.
Mm. Yeah, excellent points all the way around, I think. I definitely would read more of this myself, because I have a feeling, based on the feedback too, that like the author is just evading the answers and additional questions, like dancing just sideways of it. I feel like it's there, and I want to know what it is. So if I could read the rest of all of these stories, that would be really great for me personally, to be able to sleep tonight. That would be awesome.
That's the classic thing, is like, you know, so often the reason stories get rejected is because the actual story is starting on page 3 or page 4, and the slush reader or editor is never going to get to page 3 or page 4. They're rejecting it on page 1 when the author is just building up to the story or setting the scene for the story. And so often the resolution is, wherever the story is actually starting, push that up to page 1. Like, don't wait till page 4 to get into the story. Yeah, and it could be the same thing here. Is making the doll really the story, or is the story what happens after the doll is made?
Mm. Yeah, and as a writer, that's a really hard lesson to learn, I think. Because every time we think we've gotten a little bit closer to doing it effectively, we're like, it's not there. Where is it? I don't know. But I have been given the signal that we are very nearly out of time today for Snap Judgment. Thank you so much to all of the Apex Patreon supporters and community members that submitted to this round. For those of you who we didn't get to, we apologize. I believe that there were 18 submissions total, and we got through, I think, 9,
Nice.
maybe 10. So, but I hope very much that all of the feedback that our panel of judges had to offer today were helpful to all of you, even if we didn't get to your story in particular. If you enjoyed what you saw and heard here today, be sure to visit Apex online at apex-magazine.com. Follow us on Twitter at ApexMag. You can support us by becoming a backer on Patreon, subscribing via the website or through Waitlist Books. Thank you very much to our panel of judges, Jason Sizemore, Lesley Conner, and Arley Sorg. Arley, thank you especially for being our special guest today. And,
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. Anytime. I think we all enjoyed the comments that you had and the structure of critique that you had to offer us today. So thank you very much for being here. Thank to all of you who tuned in live, and thank you to everyone who's catching the replay later. You matter too. Leave comments on the YouTube channel if you feel the urge to do so. Throw some tweets out to us. We'd love to hear what you thought about today's submissions and today's process. And we look forward to seeing you at the very next Snap Judgment, I believe, in a couple of months, right? It's not until, I want to say
we do
May.
these every 3 months.
Every 3 months. Awesome.
So probably
April.
late April.
April-ish. April-ish.
Quarterly.
We'll keep it vague for now. April-ish. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. I'm your host and narrator, Alyson Grauer, and thank you very much for joining us today for Snap Judgment Episode 3. We'll see you next time.